Welcome to the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast, presented by the Beef Cattle Research Council, the most popular content from beefresearch.ca, available on the go. Before we get into today's episode, a quick message from the BCRC. Cowbites ration balancing software is available through the BCRC. This easy-to-use ration balancing software allows Canadian beef cattle producers to develop their own rations. Producers can input various combinations of feed and byproducts at different prices to reduce feed costs while meeting animal production targets. The software costs $60 and can be purchased now at beefresearch.ca/cowbites. That's COWBYTES. This episode features the BCRC Science Director, Dr. Reynold Bergen.
This Research on the Record article originally appeared in the August 2024 issue of Canadian Cattleman magazine, and it's been posted on the beefresearch.ca site with the publisher's permission. Today I'm going to talk about the genes behind the scenes. So the cattle you raise and the beef that they produce are the result of two main factors. One of them is their genetic potential, and the other one is the environment that they're raised in. And the environment includes the climate and the feed and the health management and your handling practices and everything else that you do. The beef industry adopts genetics a lot more slowly than the poultry or swine or dairy industries. And there's a couple of things that make genetic advancement trickier in beef cattle. So there's good reasons for this. You know, comparing the beef industry to other livestock is a lot like comparing apples to oak trees. Our production systems are very different. Pigs and poultry and dairy cows are usually raised in intensive confinement systems that really tightly control the physical environment and the diet. And that means that their production practices and the animal productivity can be reasonably similar across the entire country or even globally. When you've got a barn that largely eliminates the environmental factor, even the most demanding genetics can be managed appropriately. In contrast, cow-calf production takes place in the natural environment, and beef cows need all the genetic flexibility they can get to cope with blizzards and droughts and bogs and hills and parasites and predators and highly variable feed quality and availability and everything else that nature can throw at them. Genetics that can't flex with the conditions tend to drop out in cow-calf production. You know, that said, the feedlot sector is a lot more intensive and they likely could get a lot more out of high-performing genetics, but the calves have to make it to the feedlot first. Our marketing system between beef and the other livestock commodities are also like apples and tumbleweeds. You know, with pigs and poultry and dairy, the producer who decides or is told what genetics to use is also the producer who sells the final product, the eggs or the milk or the slaughter-ready bird or pig. And their customer provides a clear economic incentive for product quality. Cow-calf producers who don't retain ownership through the feedlot or through the slaughter are paid for weaning weight, and they're incentivized to maintain fertility and longevity. Focusing too much on better feedlot performance or feed efficiency or carcass merit genetics could lead to a trade-off in fertility or longevity. Feedlot producers would undoubtedly love to see higher efficiency, better growth, and better carcass quality genetics, but they rarely produce their own calves, and they only buy a fraction of their calves directly from cow-calf producers. So the feedlot sector works the environment side of the equation. They sort wean calves into finishing, backgrounding, or grass yearling systems based on their sex and weight and breed type, and they tailor their diet and management decisions to get the most out of the genetics they think they bought. But the genetic quality of Canada's beef cattle is actually improving behind the scenes. You know, most cow-calf buyers may not be deliberately seeking improved genetics for faster growth or better carcass grades. But if they're buying their yearling bulls from breeders who are selecting for those traits, then those improved genetics are feeding up into the whole system. And there's evidence for that. So if we go back in time and look at our grading system, after ignoring marbling for decades, Canada adopted the US marbling standards back in 1996. If we look at the grading stats between 1997 and 2023, the percent of youthful Canadian beef carcasses that fall into the lowest two quality grades, that's single and double A marbling, they've dropped from 72% back in the day to 26% now. Meanwhile, the two highest quality grades, those are AAA and Prime, rose from 28% back in 1997 up to 74% now. Carcass quality is improving, and so is growth. Over the same time period, average carcass weights for steers and heifers increased by 5.5 and 4.4 pounds per year. And those increases add up. So by 2023, steer and heifer carcasses weighed 20% more than they did back in 1997. Now the average steer carcass weighs 143 pounds more, and the average heifer carcass weighs 114 pounds more than they did back in 1997. And as an aside, that's partly why beef supply hasn't dropped as fast as cow numbers have, simply because each carcass produces more beef. And when we produce more beef from each animal, it also has played a major role in helping shrink our environmental footprint of Canadian beef. But getting back to genetics, make no mistake, improved quality grades and carcass weights were due to a lot of things, not just genetics, but also packer premiums for quality grade and smaller discounts for heavy carcasses and longer days on feed and changes in breed composition, including the recent adoption of beef on dairy crosses and changes in growth promotants and feeding practices. But genetic improvement has played a role. Breed associations calculate something called genetic trends. And what a genetic trend does is it estimates how much of the change in a trait, so carcass weight or marbling score, how much of the change is due to genetics alone once some very complicated math has taken the environmental and management effects out of the equation. These genetic trends for carcass traits aren't always or only based on actual carcass data. They often rely heavily on live animal measurements, so things like yearling weight or ultrasound measurements. Those live measurements aren't the same as carcass measurements, but they're very good predictors, and they're a lot easier to collect in very large numbers. But that also means they're independent evidence. They're based on a different data set than the packer grading data. But the important point is that the genetic trends for marbling and carcass weights in Canada's purebred, Charolais, Hereford, Simmental, and Angus cattle mirror the changes seen in the grading data. They point in the same direction. They've generally trended up over time. And if you look at the online version of this article, there's links to those genetic trends so you can see what I'm going on about. But the bottom line is that cattle can't grow or marble if they don't have the genetic potential to do so. And genetic selection for improved growth and marbling has allowed Canada's beef industry to produce higher quality beef more rapidly and more efficiently. So what does this mean to you? Well, you might not have intended to buy genetics with improved growth or carcass quality, but if your breeder has been selecting for those things, you've gotten them as part of the package, and so have the feedlots who bought your calves. And so we'll revisit some of this in a future column.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. You can find all relevant links and information at beefresearch.ca or in the show notes. The Beef Cattle Research Council is funded by the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff and strives for excellence in the production of Canadian beef, cattle, and forage through research, innovation, and extension. Tune in every Tuesday as the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast delivers straightforward insights, expert information, and a wealth of practical knowledge for Canadian beef producers. Subscribe now.